From Congress. We have a great panel of witnesses today, and I would like to yield for the opening statement the senior senator, Republican Senator, Senator Dan Coates. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to thank you and Vice Chairman KLOBUCHAR for holding this hearing on a subject I think of vital importance to the future of our nation's economy and in fact, our national security and the ever-growing debt deficit. Our spending addiction in Washington has led to the point where we are now faced the prospect of record deficits as far as the eye can see. The fact is that Congress and the executive branch have failed to address the debt crisis effectively. Temporary stopgap measures solve little, if anything. They simply put off the inevitable day of reckoning. Eventually, we will reach a point where investors either stop buying our debt or insist on higher interest rates to account for the greater risk, potentially triggering a crisis of confidence. Many experts also believe that our failure to seriously grapple with our ballooning national debt is already having a significant detrimental impact on economic growth. We all know, or at least we ought to know, that our current path is unsustainable. Academics, economists, business leaders, the various bipartisan committees that have been formed, Republicans and Democrats all basically repeat the same thing. Unless we make the tough spending choices that we've been avoiding for years, we're going to face a debt-induced meltdown. It's only a matter of time and the clock is ticking. The plain fact is, in order to make a real impact on the deficit and the federal debt, we need to go big and we need to go bold, and the time to do that is now. We need to incorporate a combination of spending discipline with mandatory structural reform of our mandatory programs and growth-oriented comprehensive tax reform. Those three elements, in my opinion, are absolutely necessary for us to achieve what we need to achieve. Today's hearing presents us with an opportunity to find common ground in tackling these difficult issues. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. I want to welcome my former colleague and friend, Senator Judd Gregg, who has had a distinguished career as chairman of the Budget Committee, someone looked to in the Congress as an expert on these issues. We're pleased to have him with us. Dr. Rivlin, I learned about your Hoosier roots this morning to go with your many other great credentials in terms of service to this country and being such an outstanding voice currently dealing with this issue. Doug Eakin, Dr. Eakin, thank you very much for your continued work. And Simon, Dr. Johnson, we thank you also. And we look forward to your testimony this morning and your guidance and support and help in terms of how we can address this critical issue, because I think the time is now to do it. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Senator. Vice Chairman KLOBUCHAR.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I wanted to also thank you for our last hearing, and I think it had a very good tone and a very good start to our year with the Joint Economic Committee, which really can be a sounding board and a place where we can come together and talk about in a very timely way the proposals that are before the Congress. I did want to mention that Rachel and her family from Minnesota are the only ones from my Minnesota breakfast that took me up on my invitation to come to this hearing. I see them back there this morning, and they are a reminder that we are talking about real families and real jobs in the future of our country here as we listen to these four great experts that appear before us. I see this as a time of great opportunity. Our economy has stabilized. The unemployment rate was the best it's been in years. Just this past month, the housing market's coming back. In my state, the unemployment rate's down to 5.6%, and we're seeing great expansion in exports and in many of our industries. But what I see is holding us back right now is the inconsistency that we've seen in tax policy. It's the fact that companies aren't able to know what's going to happen next with their investments, and the fact that we haven't gotten a clear path to bring this debt down. We have made some progress, as we all know, with the, first of all, the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission, which I think did some very good work. I was one of 14 Democratic senators that made very clear that we were not going to vote for the debt ceiling increase until we got that debt commission in place. I would have liked to see it statutory, something Senator Gregg and Senator Conrad worked so hard to do, but it is what it is, and it wasn't just a report that collected dust on a shelf. It actually gave us some ideas, as did the Rivlin Domenici work and a lot of the other work done by people right before us on this panel. Well, what's happened since the report's been released? We have achieved nearly $2.7 trillion in deficit reduction over a 10-year window. The goal of many is to at least get to the $4 trillion reduction in 10 years. The Senate proposal right now that's being marked up in the Budget Committee, proposed by Senator Murray, is another $2 trillion in reductions, and I think it's something worth looking at, and I know the House also has its own proposal. Again, I see this as an opportunity. There's a sense of urgency. Senator Coates and I were together last night at a meeting, a sense of urgency that we haven't had for a while. Some of it is caused by the effects of sequestration, which I think most people would agree is not the exact way we want to handle this, although we want to see some spending cuts. I also think that we can do this in a balanced way with a combination of revenue and spending cuts. We simply can't afford to have a repeat of what happened last December with the brinkmanship. As much as I loved spending a very romantic New Year's Eve with Harry Reid on my left and Mitch McConnell on my right, every woman's dream at the stroke of midnight, I believe that there is a much better way that we can go forward here, and I hope it's going to start this next week with keeping the government running, with the continuing resolution, as it looks like it is, hopefully putting some flexibility in with the sequestration, and then moving on to a major deal, which the President has made clear that he wants, and I think you're hearing a lot of noise from Democrats and Republicans that they'd like to see a balanced approach. So far, what we've seen of the debt reduction, which I just mentioned, the $2.7 trillion, 80% has come from spending cuts. And it comes out to a ratio of about 4-to-1 spending cuts to revenue. That's actually a different ratio and a higher on the spending cut end than that proposed by both the Simpson-Bowles and the Domenici-Rivlin proposal. So I think there is room to continue to look at revenue, whether it's closing loopholes, whether it's looking at things like I will mention as being from a state that produces a lot of biofuels, that the ethanol tax credit expired. That saved billions and billions of dollars. The oil company subsidies are still in place, that $38 billion over the next 10 years. Some of the tax breaks that are in place that incentivize companies to ship jobs overseas, that's $200 million. The home mortgage deduction, very important to me and to middle-class families. If you cap it at $500,000 in value on a home, so if you buy $1 million home, you still get it up to $500,000, that saves $41 billion. Buffett rule, $53 billion. I think there are ways that we could add revenue into this mix without setting the recovery on its back and still get the spending cuts in place and do them at a level that's different than the sequestration level. There are also proposals for Medicare. One I would throw out there is negotiation of prescription drug prices. That saves $240 billion in savings right there, as well as some of the additional delivery system reform that can be made. So I am looking forward to what our experts have to say, but overall, I feel a sense of urgency. I also feel a sense of incredible opportunity as I see that America is making things again, exporting to the world, and we have to do our jobs in Washington to allow our workers and our companies to move forward, and that means reducing our debt in a reasonable way. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Today, the title of today's hearing is Flirting with Disaster, Solving the Federal Debt Crisis. And we have a distinguished panel who took time from their busy lives as national leaders to be with us today. I'm honored to introduce former Senator Judd Gregg to our hearing today. Senator Gregg has served in his home state of New Hampshire as a governor, as a U.S. representative, and most recently, a 3-term U.S. Senator, thus making him the first elected official in the history of New Hampshire to achieve all 3 offices. During his tenure at the Senate, Senator Gregg was the chairman of the Budget Committee and is a respected leader on fiscal policy, budgetary reform, and financial regulation. He was the original author of the Conrad-Gregg legislation, which was the impetus for Simpson-Bowles, a leader of the Wyden-Gregg legislation for bipartisan tax reform, and participated in several bipartisan efforts to reform entitlements in health care. Senator Gregg served on the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, along with another of today's witnesses, Dr. Alice Rivlin, where they worked toward finding a bipartisan solution to our nation's debt crisis. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Alice Rivlin. She's currently a senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution and a visiting professor at the Public Policy Institute at Georgetown. She's previously served as vice chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and director of the Office of Management and Budget during the first Clinton administration. Dr. Rivlin was also the first director of the Congressional Budget Office after its establishment in 1975. In 2010, President Obama named Dr. Rivlin to the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, and there she worked alongside Senator Gregg to develop what is known as the Simpson-Bowles Plan. I'd like to welcome Douglas Holtz-Eakin to our hearing today. Dr. Holtz-Eakin is currently the president of the American Action Forum in Washington, D.C. He has developed a distinguished record as an academic and policy advisor. Most recently, he served as Commissioner of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, Director of Domestic and Economic Policy for the McCain presidential campaign. He served as Director of the Congressional Budget Office, assisting Congress in tax cuts and Social Security reform. He's also worked to bring economic stability as the Chief Economist at the Council of Economic Advisors during the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks. He's also taught economics at Columbia University, became the chair of the Department of Economics at Syracuse before being called to serve as director of the CBO. Welcome. And I'd like to welcome also Dr. Simon Johnson to our hearing. He is currently professor at the Sloan School of Management at MIT and a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's also a member of the Congressional Budget Office's panel of economic advisors, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. He's the founder of the economics blog, The Baseline Scenario, and is a contributor to Project Syndicate. Prior to his current positions, he was chief economist at the International Monetary Fund and taught economics at Duke University in its School of Business. Dr. Johnson brings a unique international perspective to our nation's debt crisis. With that, I would like to introduce Senator Gregg for your testimony. Senator? If you could hit that microphone.
Did it?
There you go. And I know you said that
before. This is an entirely new experience.
It's good to see how the other side lives.
A pleasurable one. Thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be here with this wonderful panel, and with my close friend Dan Coates, who I served with for, I've forgotten how many years, but it's been quite a few. And it's a pleasure to address the panel, and thank you for having me participate on this critical issue, which is critical to our nation's future and prosperity. I think it was defined in some ways, and probably best, by the Foreign Minister of Australia. He was speaking to Bob Zellick, who is former head of the World Bank, and Bob is fond of telling the story about how he said to him just a few months ago, the Foreign Minister of Australia said to him, you know, the United States is one debt deal away from leading the entire world out of economic doldrums. And that's absolutely true. When you look at our country, so much is going right in this nation right now. We are in my opinion, on the verge of a massive economic expansion due to our shift in energy primarily, but also because we're still the place where great ideas come from, whether they're Facebook or Apple, or in my region of the country, healthcare. We've got huge amounts of liquidity, and we still have an extraordinarily entrepreneurial people ready to go out and take risks and create jobs. And the one thing that's holding us back is our fiscal policy and the fact that we have this very serious and legitimate concern about the sustainability of our debt. The Simpson-Bowles Commission, which Dr. Rivlin and I served on, came to the conclusion that on our present path, this nation goes bankrupt. That's essentially the fact. Senator Coates referred to that fact. And we have to figure out how to straighten this out. We have to figure out how to do the deal that straightens this out. And I congratulate the Congress and the President for having made some progress. Not as much as needs to be made, but there has been progress. And there's a long way to go. And the question is, how do we get to the next step? And what should the goal be? Well, under Simpson-Bowles, we suggested that the goal should be to stabilize the debt at 70% of GDP or less. That's a very high number. Historically, our debt since the end of World War II has averaged about 35% of GDP. To stabilize it at 70% of GDP probably doesn't put us on a healthy path, but it keeps us going. However, if we don't stabilize it at 70% of GDP, we're obviously going to go to regions which are now being tested by countries like Greece and Spain and Italy of over 100%, which means inevitably that, as Senator Coates referred to, the markets will lose confidence in our currency, and our cost of debt will jump dramatically, and we'll have a fiscal crisis. Because think of it, if you look at the budget today, we spend about $250 billion on interest, 250 to 300 billion. If we were paying historic interest rates, we would be paying about $600 billion. $600 billion. We couldn't handle that. But we'll pay much more than historic interest rates. We'll pay a lot more if the markets lose confidence in our currency. So we've got to get this problem under control. You now are struggling with the sequester issue, which is an attempt to address the question. And the issue becomes, how should we address the question? Well, clearly the sequester should be replaced by targeted action in the area of entitlement reform, and I know members of this panel are going to talk about ways you can do that, and I'm 100% for that. And the important thing about entitlement reform is that that's where the money is, so to say. You know, Willie Sutton, you say rob banks because that's where the money is. Well, if you're looking at the deficit and the debt, the thing that's driving it is our massive cost of entitlement, so we have to reform them. And another important thing about entitlement reform is it's not tomorrow that it has to occur. We've got 5 years, 10 years, 15 years that we can work our way into policies which change and bend the cost curve over the long run, and which do it in a way which does not impact the recipients of entitlements in any significant way, but rather makes those programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security solvent. So that's one step we have to take. We also need tax reform, which has been referred to here. The Wyden Coates proposal is an approach to that. But how do you structure this action? I've been thinking about this, and this is where I wanted to end. How do you get this done? Well, I think actually, how do you get the deal done? Well, I think actually the Speaker of the House has laid out a pathway. He said, let the Senate do it. Well, that's an interesting idea, and it's not a bad idea, by the way, with presidential leadership. And I congratulate the President for, in the last few weeks, stepping forward and saying, I'm going to get in the room on this issue. So I believe you can set up a structure here where you use the Senate as a sounding board, because there is a working center in the Senate, with presidential leadership, where you develop a package which can actually address this issue substantively. And then take that package to the House, as the Speaker has suggested, rather than have the House initiate it and take it to the Senate. I would caution this, that the budget process is probably not going to be that process, because the budget process is inherently partisan. That's the nature of the budget process. It may set the goalposts at both ends of the field, but when budgets reach the floor, especially in the Senate, they end up with a lot of votes being cast that lock in opinions and positions which are not very flexible. And to get this done, you're going to have compromise on both sides of the aisle. Two other points, structural points, which have to be part of any major deal. One is that you have to target the size of the government. Simpson-Bowles said it at 21% or 21.3%. That sets everything in motion, spending restraint and revenues. And secondly, any changes in entitlements must be subject to a 67-vote point of order before they can be reversed. Otherwise, you can't lock them down for future Congresses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. And to be clear, letting the Senate go first wasn't our first option, but we are where we are. And so we understand. Dr. Rivlin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Klobuchar. I agree with everything my colleagues, Senator Gregg has said. Let me begin by saying this hearing is entitled Flirting with Disaster, Solving the Debt Crisis. Let me respectfully suggest an alternative title, Growing the Economy and Stabilizing the Debt. And I make that suggestion because I think prosperity requires bipartisan cooperation to achieve two goals at once. One is faster economic growth and lower unemployment, and the other is a sustainable long-run budget plan that will halt the projected rise in the debt-to-GDP ratio and put it on a downward trajectory. It's not a choice. These two goals reinforce each other. Stabilizing and reducing future debt does not require immediate austerity. On the contrary, excessive budgetary austerity in a still slowly recovering economy undermines both goals. But it does require a firm plan enacted soon to halt the rising debt-to-GDP ratio and reduce it over coming decades. And putting the budget on a sustainable path and reducing debt will require bipartisan agreement on entitlement reform that slows the growth of health care spending and puts Social Security on a firm foundation for future retirees, and does that soon. It will also require raising additional revenue through comprehensive tax reform. I believe that enough discretionary spending restraint has already been accomplished, more than we suggested in Simpson-Bowles and Domenici-Rivlin. So, and that's why I think the sequester is really bad policy and should be replaced with entitlement reform and tax reform. I think we all know the reasons why entitlement reform is imperative. The combination of the demographics and health care spending growth makes Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security the drivers of unsustainable federal spending in future years. Social Security should be the easiest to reform because it involves only money without the complexity of health care delivery, and it requires fairly minor, well-understood tweaks in benefits and revenues to regain fully funded status. Enactment of a bipartisan Social Security reform now would reassure current workers, demonstrate that our democracy works to solve problems before they reach crisis proportions, and contribute to stabilizing the debt. We can't afford to wait on Social Security, whether we do it separately, as Senator Durbin is suggesting, or as part of the budget reform. Workers who will be retiring in 2033 are already in their mid-40s. We owe it to them to ensure that they can plan for Social Security as they reach retirement age. Medicare raises more complex issues, but even there, a bipartisan compromise to slow Medicare growth without depriving seniors of needed health care is surely possible. American health care is expensive compared to that of other developed nations, and its quality is uneven. And part of the reason is our fee-for-service reimbursement system, which encourages providers to deliver more services, but does not reward efficiency or quality. We can convert Medicare by changing the incentives to a more efficient system. There are two possible approaches to improving the performance of health providers along those lines, and one is to change the incentives in traditional Medicare toward rewarding quality and not quantity, and I'm for that. The other is to foster competition among health plans on a regulated exchange or market. We need to try both. And we don't need to do it by replacing Medicare with a premium support model. We could introduce the competitive element more smoothly by ensuring that Medicare Advantage plans compete in a more transparent marketplace and improve incentives to lower costs. Finally, there's the question of tax reform. Both the commissions that I served on had base broadening and rate lowering plans, and we must do something like that. But let me reiterate in closing that both growth and debt stabilization are important, and they should be done simultaneously. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rivlin. Dr. Holtz-Egan?
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman KLOBUCHAR, and members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of being here today. And let me just say at the outset, it's an honor to be on this panel with my former boss, Senator Gregg, and the founding director of the CBO, and a gentleman who teaches an institution where I couldn't get into graduate school. So I'm honored. No hearing is complete without a chart from CBO, so why don't we just start with the facts and remind ourselves that the most recent projections from CBO are actually quite daunting in my view. They say that on autopilot, we accumulate $7 trillion in additional deficits over the next 10 years. And even more troubling, the trajectory is one where any illusory near-term improvement reverses about 2015 or 16, and we see the sharp spiral upward in the deficit, and importantly, in the debt in the hands of the public. That is part one of the bad news that comes out of the CBO this January. The second part is that underneath that is an economic projection which shows slow growth in 2013, about 1.4%, and a market write-down in the long-term growth potential of the U.S. economy, about 2.2% over the long term. And I at least believe that those are not unrelated phenomena, the debt and the growth. There is a literature, largely attributed to the scholars Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, that suggests that countries that have gross debt, a slightly different measure of debt, over 90% of GDP, pay a penalty in the form of slower growth. The CBO projection says that the United States, which currently has federal debt in excess of the size of GDP, over 100% of GDP, will remain at that level over the next 10 years, and thus will continuously pay a penalty in the form of slower economic growth, about 1 percentage point a year is the estimate. That translates into all sorts of things that are very close to home: 1 million jobs, slower income growth for American families, and a recipe for stagnation that the U.S. has the great opportunity to avoid and should. And I concur with what Senator Gregg said at the outset. We have the capacity to do much better, and this is the brake on our growth. Now, what would it take to fix that? To get us out of the danger zone, to get us below 90% of GDP, requires something north of $4 trillion. And while I applaud the efforts of the Congress and the administration in past years, I think it is not time to rest on our laurels. Our problems are significant and remain large. And smaller measures, those which merely stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, in my view, are in fact flirting with disaster. They say that should interest rates spike, as the Senator mentioned, or if economic growth does not turn out to be as robust as we might hope, the debt is not stabilized. It moves north quickly, and runs the risk of generating a loss of confidence in the U.S. in world capital markets. And so I think that we can't merely stop at trying to stabilize something which will, at the end of the 10 years of stabilization, go north again anyway. It's time to be aggressive. I think that's not inconsistent with more rapid economic growth. I think it's a foundation of more rapid economic growth. Now, how do you do that? We can have a longer discussion, but sadly, we are not the first country with the dual problems of bad growth and big debt. It's happened before, and if you look around the globe, there's no perfect solution, but to the extent that a playbook emerges, it contains some components that have come up today. One should undertake a comprehensive tax reform and use that as the foundation for better economic growth and financing the government. And one should use the spending side to control the growth of debt. But not all spending is created equal. The core functions of government, national security, infrastructure, basic research, education, need to be preserved in this process. And instead, the focus should be on cutting transfer programs, which in the United States means dealing with the entitlement programs, the Social Security's, Medicare's, Medicaids that Dr. Rivlin mentioned. I will point out, and I say this lovingly and gently, that the current strategy, which is to sharply raise taxes at the beginning of the year without reform and to slash discretionary spending as far as the eye can see, is 180 degrees opposite what we should be doing. And other than that, we're doing fine. But this is an opportunity. I agree with that. We do have the ability to reform, especially Social Security, which you can reform any of a number of ways and send the signal that we know how to deal with our problems, take some red ink out of our future and deal with the debt, and that would be a great first step toward addressing what I think is the paramount issue of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee, for the invitation. I agree with some of the points that have been made by my distinguished colleagues. I think this is an opportunity. I would recommend, drawing on the international experience to which you mentioned at the beginning, Mr. Brady, my work with the International Monetary Fund, my work on economic crises over 25 years around the world, I think you should aim for more debt reduction over the next 2 decades than even Senator Gregg suggested. I think a target debt to GDP by 2030 in the range of 40 to 50% makes sense, because you don't know what's going to happen. A country like the United States, with our position in the world, needs to have what the IMF likes to call fiscal space, the opportunity, the ability to take on challenges, both domestic, for example, in the case of another financial crisis, or international. We don't know what's going to come our way. So I think you should seize this moment. And I agree also with my colleagues, there are some things on the table, including Social Security reform, that are achievable. I think, unfortunately, we are perhaps inadvertently, already in a fiscal disaster. Senator Coates is, of course, correct. There is one kind of fiscal disaster that involves people not being willing to buy your debt, interest rates go up, the currency collapses, and you go hand in cap to the International Monetary Fund. That's not our reality today, obviously, and I doubt that's what we face over the next decade or two. I think we're much more likely to get what Dr. Holtz-Eakin referred to, which is a confused combination of policies that emerge from our distinguished and wonderful constitutional system, don't get me wrong, but the way it's playing out is a bit unfortunate, and particularly undermining what Dr. Holtz-Eakin said, which is the essential public goods that the government provides, research and development, for example, this defense, the readiness of our military forces, also an essential part of maintaining prosperity. I think what we should do, and what I hope you will do, is assess the programs that we have, both in terms of their pro-growth impact, which is the returns on much of that. I read the CBO literature carefully. The returns are impressive. And not just Social Security, but also the social insurance we provide through the healthcare system. And that, I think we all agree, is the big sticking point. I don't think the issue there, by the way, is Medicare per se. Obviously, the numbers Dr. Holtz-Eakin showed are correct. You want to look out 50, 70 years, it's all about healthcare, but it's healthcare spending, not just the government provided part of healthcare. It's the entire healthcare spending, the drivers of healthcare spending. If you take those out of the budget and shift them onto firms or onto families, that's a big competitive disadvantage to the American companies. I talk a lot to CFOs and CEOs about tax reform, corporate tax reform, and I think there are some sensible ideas out there, but I always impress on them that in 20 years, the big driver of loss of competitiveness in the United States is going to be our healthcare system. I think I've recommended to many of you and to your staff before, but I recommend again, Statistical Table 12A in the IMF's fiscal monitor publication. All the good stuff in the IMF papers is at the back in the statistical tables. 12A compares projections of healthcare spending and the impact on budget, looking out 20, 30, 40 years across the countries we're going to be competing with. And this is where we really look bad. We have to get a handle on that. And you have to decide, with an aging population, with improvements in medical technology, with an inability or great difficulty of running private insurance schemes for people who are in their 80s and 90s, that was the experience before Medicare, that'll be the experience if Medicare ends, how much social insurance do you want to provide? And what, as Senator Gregg said, what's the size of government as a percent of GDP that is consistent with that? And I'm afraid, in the numbers that I look at, again, drawing on the CBO, 21% of GDP is low, looking at over 3-4 decades, because of what's happening to the nature of our population. And this, of course, brings us to the most difficult issue, which is revenue. I do see how you could balance the budget in 10 years without increasing revenue. I read Mr. Ryan's budget proposal. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's conducive with continued growth, let alone accelerating growth or the kind of prosperity we're hoping for. I think that the specifics that Senator Klobuchar put on the table, the specifics that are in the Senate budget proposal that Senator Murray presented yesterday, I think those are absolutely have to be part of the agenda. And I hope they're part of the conversation, and I hope they're part of the compromise. As Senator Gregg said, we are one good debt deal away from another great period of American prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I have to confess I'm hope to live my entire life without ever reading the IMF statistical table 12A. Just let me be clear there. One, testimony was excellent. I had a chance to read it earlier this week. It was very insightful. I think to Dr. Holtz-Eakin's point, the growth gap of the current recovery and the prospect, not reality, prospect of potential GDP falling permanently over the long haul is a concern of the Joint Economic Committee. And together, in a bipartisan way, we're going to look at ways we can close that, both on fiscal and monetary side as we go forward. I have a couple questions I'd like to run through quickly. None of them are gotcha questions, and we rarely have this opportunity with you four experts here. So on making Social Security and Medicare solvent over the long term, critical to all this, timing. How soon should Congress and the President act to assure investors, to avoid a potential downgrade, to really address our financial situation? Senator, each of you, how soon should we act on reaching the solution?
I think you have to act to show seriousness of purpose as soon as possible. And when you do that, I think some of the growth issue is going to be addressed, because I think the markets will respond, as will the investment community, to that sort of action.
Yeah,
That means setting up a definable process for getting to closure on an agreement on entitlement spending and on revenues.
Got it. You're thinking this year or next?
Oh, this year
year.
before June, hopefully.
Thank you. Dr. Rivlin?
For Social Security, I would say 10 years ago, but this year will do. We've known about this problem for a long time and haven't fixed it. On Medicare, I would say right now, we are still learning about how to improve the efficiency of health care, but I think the accumulating knowledge gives us enough to go on right now.
Got it. Dr. Holtz-Eakin?
I don't have a clever way to impart a greater sense of urgency. I mean, the sooner the better, let's face it. And there's some demographic mechanics that make this an imperative. If you think about changing Social Security, for example, and there's been the convention of grandfathering those who are of a certain age or younger, 55 or younger. I'm now 55. I'm the trailing edge of the baby boom generation. If you grandfather me, you grandfathered the problem. And so the bumper sticker should be "Get Doug Holtz-Eakin" and get him this year.
We'll get that printed up. And you're talking about timing this year, act now, not now, federal government 10 years. Got it. Dr. Johnson?
Well, for the record, I'd like to note that Dr. Rivlin has actually been warning us all about this since the 1980s, so it's 20, 30 years ago. And I think you should act immediately. Why not establish a bipartisan commission along the lines of that established by President Reagan and Congress in the 1980s? Specifically, I would suggest to deal with Social Security. That is surely not an easy problem, but a problem where the two sides seem better able to come together. On health care, on Medicare, that seems more difficult, and I agree with showing purpose would be very helpful. And if there are ways to take that away from the intensity of the partisan discussion, that would be extremely constructive, but I'm not sure I've seen that on the table yet.
And I agree. We ought to be, we could save Social Security this afternoon. Truth is, we all know what needs to be done. Along those lines, there's talk about change CPI and Social Security and some means testings, Medicare. Are those two reforms alone enough to make those programs solvent over the long term, or do we need to do more? Senator?
Those would go an inordinate amount of the way, but you should also adjust the bend points, obviously, which is means testing and probably the age. And Simpson-Bowles, interestingly, Simpson-Bowles, we decided to take Social Security out of the deficit debate and the debt debate and deal with it separately. I understand Senator Durbin is suggesting that also. And there are only 4 or 5 moving parts.
Yeah.
They can be adjusted so quickly if you can get the politics to agree to do it.
Yeah.
And that's why doing it independent of the debt issue is, I think, so important, to take the politics out of the issue. And in my view, if the Durbin approach was followed, it should be, that commission should report by Easter and vote on it before the summer recess.
Dr. Rivlin?
you need to do more. On the change CPI, that's a technical change which would improve the estimate of inflation in the benefits, but it need not be done in a way that hurts low-income or especially older people. In the Domenici-Rivlin plan, we did go for change CPI, but we also bumped up the minimum benefit and a benefit at age, I think, 85, so that you don't disadvantage people over who live a long time. I'm increasingly for that. And on Medicare, yes, you need to do both, and I'm not a fan of raising the age at this time, actually.
Got it. Thank Dr. Holtz-Egan.
I would concur. I think you need to do more, no question. On Social Security, I think it's very important to remember that you're really not doing more. The current plan is that the program will remain actuarially solvent, and the way we're going to do it is in 20 years we'll have essentially a Social Security sequester, and across the board cut at 25%. That's a disgraceful way to run a pension program. And so it's not about doing more to Social Security, it's about doing something more intelligent and doing it now so that people can plan.
Great.
On Medicare, I think the number one priority should be to put it on a budget. Right now, the gap between payroll taxes and premiums going in, spending going out, is $300 billion a year. It's a third of our $1 trillion deficits. It's got 10,000 new beneficiaries every day. So you have to send the signal to the provider and the beneficiary community that there's a certain amount of money, go do something smart with it.
Great.
And that would be the stop thing.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Well, Congressman, as you know, on Social Security, we didn't index the maximum wage subject to Social Security. I would go back to what worked for Ronald Reagan. If it worked for Ronald Reagan, it should work for us today. And on the, I think you should look at pension age, but you have to be very careful that while longevity on average has increased substantially, American males age 65 are expected to live 3 years longer than was the case in 1970. That's not true across the entire wage distribution. Manual workers, lower income people lower income males have not had an increase in longevity. I think you want to be very careful about balancing those adjustments in that framework. And just changing the CPI, it doesn't do that for you.
Can I interrupt?
On Medicare,
If I may, Dr. I apologize. We're going to let you step forward in just a second. I want to turn this over to Vice Chairman KLOBUCHAR, but quick question. A lot of talk about tax increases again. We've had a first round of about $1 trillion in the President's new health care law, half a dozen of which have kicked in this year. Republicans, Democrats agreed on $600 billion plus at the beginning of this year as part of the fiscal agreement. Absent fundamental tax reform, does anyone on the panel want to argue that another round of tax increases will be helpful to this struggling economy? Vice Chairman?
Do you want them to answer?
I actually got the answer I wanted, so you know, it's like Moneyball, hang up, you know, Vice Chairman?
Okay. We can go back and answer some of those later. I just wanted to get some common ground here. It appears as though all of our witnesses agree that sequestration is not the best solution right now. Is that correct? And that
If I could just annotate that, it is a better solution than doing nothing.
Okay, thank you. But we could do this in a more nuanced way in terms of where the spending cuts hit. All right? And then also that we should be doing something to keep Social Security solvent, and that there are many ways to do that. I'm not going to get into those details. I thought that the chairman did a good job of getting some of those answers, but that could be done in a way that the savings would go back into Social Security, as Senator Durbin has suggested, and there's many ways that we could do that. And I guess my question is, as we go forward here, two. One is the substance of how we should do this balance with the spending cuts and revenue, and the second is something Senator Gregg raised about how we get this done procedurally, because I completely share in this view that we are one debt dealing away from being able to not only expand, but to also tackle some of these other issues that we have to work on in Congress, whether it's immigration reform or whether it's some of the workforce training issues that we are confronting right now. I mentioned about how with the spending cuts, when you include sequester, about 80% enacted since 2011 has been spending cuts for the debt reduction. and that is not consistent with where the Rivelin, Domenici, or Simpson bowls were. What balance do you think would be best? I think I'll just ask you two that question first, starting with Dr. Rivelin and then Senator Gregg. With the remaining amount to get to at least the $4 trillion.
I think it works out to roughly half and half. I'm not sure how we add up the numbers exactly, but we need substantial increases in revenue from tax reform. I would not give a positive answer to the chairman's previous question. We have lots of room to reduce spending in the tax code, and we need to do that, and it will produce more revenue in a progressive way over time, and we need to do that.
And you see that as, if we do it in the right way, and I threw a few ideas out there, and obviously you have some as well, that we could do that in addition to making some spending cuts and then some of the entitlement reforms that you suggested, that we could do that in a way that wouldn't set us back, which is, I think, important to everyone up here.
I think we have done enough cutting in discretionary spending as a total. You can reallocate it toward more growth-producing things, and perhaps over time away from defense and toward domestic. But I would not say more discretionary cuts were the priority at all. I think the stabilization of the debt depends on reforming the entitlements.
Senator Gregg?
Well, I think in order to get Republican buy-in on further revenues, you're going to have to do policy changes in entitlement accounts that bend the curves in the out year in a very substantial way and make it clear that those accounts are sustainable. And once you do that, you can get a buy-in, I believe, from many Republicans on the issue of taxes through tax reform. And that's, fixing a number to that, well, Simpson Bowles was 3-1, theoretically. The president's been 2-1. My view is that it's the policy that should drive this, and the key policy is entitlement reform that bends the out-year curve.
Mm-hmm. And I know, coming from New Hampshire, you've seen some of the Dartmouth studies on the delivery system reform and the Mayo model and those things that I hope would be a part of this.
Absolutely. I don't think you can get there without doing what Dr. Rivelin referred to, which is you shift from a utilization system to a qualities and outcome system. You start to capitate the cost so that your people are, the system is reimbursed on the individual as versus on the procedure. And that's going to get you where you want to go. And interestingly enough, there's a massive amount of activity occurring in the marketplace right now. It's occurring in your state at the Mayo Clinic. It's occurring in Utah. It's occurring in Pittsburgh. It's occurring at Baylor to try to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm. And then to this process issue, which we talked about some when I saw you yesterday. It's when you talked about the Senate going first, and I appreciated the chairman's not being even snarky about the Senate. One of my favorite former House members, Congressman Obersar, always used to joke that all they ever do in the Senate is confirm judges and ratify treaties. And I said, we haven't even been confirming enough judges lately. But I think things have greatly improved in the last year in terms of getting some of the mid-sized bills through the Senate, whether it's the Farm Bill, the Patent Reform Bill, the Transportation Bill. And as you noted, I see a lot of hope with this group in the middle that is working on the debt. And I wondered if you could talk about, if we pass a budget in the House and Senate, as I think is happening as we speak, then how we procedurally get to this place where we are in a conference committee, but then we allow the Senate to work with the president, who clearly is now very engaged in this issue, to come up with some kind of deal that could be the true compromise you're talking about.
Well, Dr. Holzhagen would probably have a view on this, but I think that the budget process is probably the wrong vehicle because when it hits the floor, you're going to see all sorts of hot-button amendments which are going to put people in positions of voting and formalizing their position in a way which isn't constructive to compromise. And then, assuming you could even get a conference, the vehicle for getting something significant done would be reconciliation. And you cannot do significant health care reform through reconciliation, in my opinion, even though Obamacare was allegedly done that way. But you really can't do it because reconciliation inherently produces, instead of getting a horse, you get a camel, in fact, a multi-back camel, because of the Byrd Rule, which goes through and makes public policy on, it just eviscerates the good public policy, the Byrd Rule does. So I think you're going to need a new vehicle. You're going to need the president leading the group. The president's got to be in the room, and he's got to bring everybody together. He says, and people have to agree on what they need to do, and then you develop the vehicle to accomplish the goal.
And I know a lot of this was just the sort of what we saw in the papers, but I've seen numbers on this. It seemed to me at the end of the year that the president and the Speaker Boehner and their proposals weren't that far apart in terms of optimism for trying to get this done. Has anyone looked at those? And Dr. Rivlin? Anyone?
Yes, I think they were very close. And the importance of having the president help broker the deal, I think, is very high.
Okay. Do you want to add something here, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, Dr. Johnson, just generally to my questions?
Close doesn't count until you get a signature, so there's a lot of work to be done. And I think this discussion underestimates the importance of getting the White House involved. And the White House needs to exercise a degree of leadership that's been missing. Only the White House can put out a proposal that says this is a national issue, only the president's elected by all the people. And his missing in action on this over the past years has stopped the super committee from being successful. That was a lot of good work. It was done with great intention. Didn't get across the finish line. Things only get across the finish line with White House leadership, and it's an imperative at this moment.
Dr. Johnson?
Senator, we spend about 17, 18% of GDP on healthcare. The British spend 8%. Our government spends 8%. We get about the same outcomes as the British. I'm not recommending their system, but I think using the pricing, using the power over to negotiate the cost of prescription medicines in this context and other assertions of the market power of the government when you're buying that much healthcare is essential if you want to control the costs.
Okay, very good. Well, I appreciate all your comments. Actually, Senator Murphy is going to fill in for me, I believe, for a while, and I'm going to be over at Judiciary, but I thank you for what you've done, and I do see some common ground here, and I see some common ground up here, especially in our really strong belief that we have to get this done and get moving on this, and the time for games is over. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Senator Coates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate the comments from all of you, particularly from Senator Gregg and supported by others, and not just the what. We've been debating what should we do for a long time now. And we've had numerous commissions and committees and so forth and so on, but also the how. Because if time is of the essence, and I think there's unanimous agreement that we need to do this now. We run into political difficulties really once we get past July. People start focusing on the next election in 2014. Members are looking, what do I need to do to protect myself from the onslaught of why did you do this, and primaries and so forth. And then you're into a presidential cycle. And so that pushes real opportunities like this one into about 2017, which I think most of you would conclude is way too late. So this is the time. And this is the time to do it. And so focusing on the how do we get it done, I appreciate Senator Gregg's contributions in that regard. And the question, Dr. Rivlin, you said in your testimony, you said that comprehensive tax reform and the other reforms that needed to be made to stabilize the debt need to be simultaneous. How do we make these simultaneous? And I guess I asked that question of Senator Gregg because you were talking about the how. If we all agree that they need to be simultaneous, there's a lot of talk about, comprehensive tax, that takes a year, at least a year. It's going to take more than a year and so forth. And right now, they're separated in terms of what we need to do now. So it's discretionary and spending and mandatory now, tax reform later. So, Senator Gregg, do you have a suggestion as to how we push tax reform as simultaneously with this other effort?
I think you need an agreement that is a hybrid reconciliation bill. Probably shouldn't even be called reconciliation, but that essentially outlines in very specific language as to what the committees of jurisdictions must do and the time frame that they must do it, so that they're reporting back comprehensive tax reform and entitlement reform essentially on a time track that's very visible, very transparent, and everybody knows it has to be done. And failure to do that needs, in my opinion, a fallback position which forces action. Maybe you just take Simpson Bowles and use it as your fallback position with something like that, so that you end up with, or Wyden Coates would actually be an excellent fallback position on the tax side, so that you get something done and you have a clear pathway, and and it's subject to certain rule requirements which force it to be done.
Yeah, appreciate the plug for White and Coats. Anybody else want to comment on that? I think the question pretty much has been answered, but let me go to a second. Michael Boskin and Adam Goolsbee testified for us just a few weeks ago. We were talking about balance, and that question has come up. Dr. Boskin said, well, there's two different types of balance. The president basically defines balance in more of a socioeconomic way. That is, in fairness, requires 50% taxes, 50% spending. He said, but economic balance doesn't fit that model at all. The ratio, if you want to achieve the kind of growth that's necessary and put us on the right path and deal with this debt deficit issue, that balance needs to be, he said, 5-to-1 or 6-to-1 ratio. Adam Goolsbee said, well, at least there ought to be a 3-to-1 ratio and not lower than that. Well, currently we're either at a 2-to-1 with the political system essentially right now saying, no, it needs to be 1-to-1. What are your thoughts on that? Let me start at the other end with Dr. Johnson.
Well, on this point, I think, Senator, I disagree with Dr. Boskin. I think that, again, you have to go program by program, and I understand this format. We don't have a lot of time to do this. I did write a book on this topic. I understand Mr. Brady may not want to read that either. But if you go through what does the government do, and I think to your point, which is a very good point, what gets in the way of growth, what's good for growth, what gets in the way of growth, and what is part of a reasonable, fairly basic, compared to other countries, but reasonable system of social insurance that we've developed over the decades. When I look at it that way from the bottom up, I come to the position that while there are important changes to be made on the spending side, some of which you've already done, some of which Senator KLOBUCHAR talked about, I lean much more towards overall the revenue side. The Bush tax cuts took about $4 trillion, looking over the decade basis that we usually do, about $4 trillion in revenue out of the system. I would seek, and I was trying to dissent on your earlier question, Chairman Brady, I would seek to replace that, not immediately, not with immediate austerity, so don't please misquote me on that, but over 2 decades, I would like us to get back to the kind of revenue trajectory we were on prior to the Bush tax cuts. And then we have to look, going beyond the 2 decades, at Dr. Holtz-Eakin's chart and say, okay, what's happening to the demographics of our population, to the income-earning capabilities, to the kind of health care people want and hope to get when they're 95,
Thank you.
when you're out in 2050.
Thank you. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you want to comment on that?
I mean, economic balance says revenues match expenditures, and that's the only balance that has any sort of substantive foundation. The rest is politics, and all these ratios are politics. Everyone in this town loves to talk about taxes. You know, I used to have hair, and they were still talking about taxes back then, and all we talk about is taxes. The fundamental decision the government makes is to spend the money. So I would go back to what Senator Gregg said. Design the programs, decide how large the government's going to be, do a tax reform to finance it so that the budget balances, which is something a discipline we have lost in the federal government, needs to be restored.
Dr. Rivlin?
I don't see any magic in Mike Boskin's assertion that there's a specific ratio of taxes that is most conducive to growth. I think we can make our tax system a lot more conducive to growth by getting rid of the spending in the tax code or reducing it and still raise considerable more revenue in a more pro-growth way. And I don't think it's realistic that a country with our values can absorb half again as many seniors over the next 10 years by reducing their benefits in order to get to balance that way. It's just not realistic.
My time's expired, but quick comment, Senator Gregg?
Well, I think the appropriate way to approach this is to set the size of the government as a percent of GDP. Once you've done that, everything else flows from that. Historically, it's been 19.8% with a massive expansion in retirees. Simpson Bowles agreed to go to 21.5. Somewhere between those two numbers is probably the right number.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Cummings?
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things that, first of all, Dr. Johnson, thank you for referring to entitlements as social insurance, because that's exactly what it is. Sometimes I think we forget that. And one of my concerns, Dr. Rivlin and Senator Gregg, is that when we're dealing with entitlements, chain CPI, raising the age, things of that nature, at what point do we get where people simply are placed in a position, say, for example, where they've got to go take a voucher out to get insurance, and they're not able to afford it? At what point does it become counterproductive? In other words, folk not able to get the health care that they need, or falling into a situation where, like many African-American males, they die now before they even get Social Security. They die, they're dead. Or say if you change the age with regard to Medicare, needing Medicare when you can't get it or whatever. And I'm just wondering, Mark Zandi came here a while back, and one of the things that he said was the thing that drives Medicare costs, of course, is the cost of medicine. And he said that he felt that there was some sign that the cost of medicine in Medicare, that inflation of Medicare costs, was at least beginning to stabilize, and he said that he believed that it was in part due to the Affordable Care Act. And I'm just wondering, how do you all see that? I'm really concerned because a lot of my constituents, all they have is Social Security and Medicare. That's it. They don't have any pensions. They don't have any savings. Many of them have been victims of the recession, lost their homes, lost all their equity. So I'm just, and there are a lot of people like that, but nobody seems to. It sounds like you all took it in consideration with the Domenici-Rivlin report, where you looked at older folks and you need to have different formulas and that kind of thing. But I'm just curious. I know there's a lot there, but I'd like for you to address that. And finally, how important is it, Senator Gregg? And I agree that we need to separate Social Security from all of this, the other things that the other social insurance type matters that we're dealing with.
I think you're raising absolutely the right considerations. When you do either Social Security reform or Medicare reform, you have to look at who is impacted by it. But I believe you can put Social Security back on a firm foundation without not only without making it harder for low-income, low earners, but as I said, in Domenici-Rivlin, we actually increased the benefits, made them better off in the reforms that we put in place. And then you have to do some compensatory things at the high end, a little less generous benefits for people with higher income. In Medicare, I believe that we can make our system more efficient by rewarding quality and outcomes across the board and getting away from fee-for-service in a way that doesn't hurt anybody in the near term. Now, maybe in a few decades, we will have to worry about rationing care, but we have such an inefficient health system that we can squeeze out some of this duplication and excess spending on health without hurting patients, I truly believe.
Senator Gregg?
I think Dr. Rivlin's absolutely correct on both points, and Simpson-Bowles did the same thing that the Domenici-Rivlin did, which was to actually increase benefits to single women over 85 and low-income individuals. And I actually believe if you do Medicare reform correctly, you actually get a better system at a lower cost, which is exactly what we need, which is what Dr. Johnson's point is. You can't have our healthcare system absorbing so much of the economy. Do you separate out Social Security from the others? I think you should. My concern about doing it too quickly, although it should be done immediately, without moving the other part of the equation, is it's going to take a lot of air out of the balloon once you fix Social Security to do the rest of the problems. Even though substantively it doesn't impact our long-term debt dramatically to fix Social Security, it psychologically would, and I'm not sure how much energy would remain to do the Medicare fixes and the tax reform if you did Social Security unilaterally and on a separate track. But it can be done, it should be done, because it's doable.
Johnson?
just one point on the age of Medicare, which hasn't really come up yet, but obviously it's in the mix. I think that's one you should worry about a great deal, Congressman. If you move that from 65 to 67, that's going to impact exactly the groups that you're worried about. This is a very hard risk to insure. It's going to be expensive if they do it by themselves. Their companies are not going to want to take on that risk. That's an additional hit to American competitiveness, by the way. So moving the age of Medicare, I agree, of course, with making the system run better, with controlling the price of prescription drugs. It's got to be essential. I would not advise increasing the age at which people qualify for Medicare.
Can I just add a footnote to that? I mean, in the aftermath of the Affordable Care Act, we have exchanges which have subsidies for low-income Americans of any age, and presumably they would provide quality insurance. And so the notion that somehow changing Medicare is going to leave people outside the safety net is just not true.
Well, unfortunately, and as I close, there's a proposal to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, so we kind of take that into consideration too. I don't think it's going anywhere, but thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Representative Paulson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing and some very similar and common themes, actually, from all of you that have taken the time to testify today. There is a question right now, knowing that debt is an issue and it's a drag on our economy. I want to dive into this a little bit deeper with Dr. Holtz-Eakin, but it absolutely is an issue. The question is sort of how urgent of an issue is it right now? I know that Senator Gregg had a column recently in the Hill from February 25th, and how the window of opportunity is closing. Mr. Chairman, if I could just submit that for the record, that'd be great. And also mention the President, just yesterday in an interview, he actually said that we don't have an immediate crisis in terms of debt. He said for the next 10 years, we are in a sustainable place. And that's kind of an interesting comment to me. I think CBO kind of backs up. We've got a serious growth gap now. There's a drag on the economy in terms of having a report that says debt held by the public is projected to remain historically high relative to the size of the economy for the next decade. And already such a debt would increase the risk of a fiscal crisis, during which investors would lose so much confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget that the government would be unable to borrow at affordable rates. And what is clear, there is this correlation between high levels of government debt and slower growth. And Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you didn't touch on it in your oral testimony, but in the written testimony, you did talk about this 1 percentage point penalty. And can you just talk a little bit real quick on that based on your testimony regarding that 1 percentage point penalty when you're at a certain level above 90% of debt and the drag on the economy? And I should ask you this too, do CBO's projections of employment and income growth, do they fully account for the loss imposed by slower economic growth, in your view?
Well, I mean, the empirical finding, this is not my finding, but this is out of the literature, is that highly indebted countries, over 90% of GDP gross debt, is the measure of debt used here, pay about a 1 percentage point, that's the median estimate, penalty in growth per year. And often the question is sort of how does this happen miraculously that we grow more slowly? But if you think about where we are with dramatic levels of debt, over 100% of GDP, and projections that show an unsustainable trajectory, if you don't make a commitment to control spending, then what have you said to the world? You've said, well, if you want to locate here or hire here, expand here, then you face two futures. Future number one is where we don't do anything. We don't fix the spending, we don't fix anything, and we hit a financial crisis. It's not exactly a pro-growth policy. Or future number two is one where we try to tax our way out of this problem. And that's utterly detrimental to growth, particularly given where we are. And so it's not surprising to me that heavily indebted countries, particularly when you get out in the tail where we're headed, have bad growth problems. It's a terrible signal to send. And so that, I think, it merits some fixing. Now, I just want to say, there's this counter argument that says, no, we want to spend now, stimulus. These aren't as, not a big fan of that, but they're not in as big a conflict as you might think, because if we do the right reforms that everyone here has talked about, go where the money is in the mandatory spending, you can take the pressure off the discretionary side. You don't have to have discretionary austerity, and we can do a lot better.
Yeah, I would concur. That would be the right direction. Let me just ask this question for everyone on the panel real quick, because it seems to be almost universal in the testimony that in these bipartisan plans, part of the focus should be on focusing on fixing the tax code, right? And economists call for lowering rates, especially the corporate rate, broadening the base, eliminating loopholes. However, at times at the Capitol, most of the discussion has been centered around on boosting revenue as a part of the existing code from reforms. Should the discussion about higher revenues focus on reforming the tax code to spur higher economic growth levels, or should it be more focused on getting more revenues out of the existing tax code? Senator Gregg, we'll just go right down.
I think Simpson Bowles got it right on this point. We reduced deductions and exemptions so that we generated $1.1 trillion of revenue every year. We took $1 trillion of that and reduced rates. So the rates under Simpson Bowles were 9, 15, and 23% on the individual sides. We took $100 billion and reduced debt. So over the 10 years of the Simpson Bowles $4 trillion number, $1 trillion came out of revenue and $4 trillion came out of was represented as being savings. But the purpose of the tax reform in Simpson Bowles was to create a tax code which would energize massive growth, where people would invest for the purposes of return rather than for the purposes of avoiding taxes. And as a result, you would not only get the static number of $100 billion of more revenue coming into the Treasury, but you'd get an actual dynamic number of much more than that.
Dr. Rivlin?
I think fortunately it's not a choice. If we do the right thing on reforming the tax code, we'll have more revenues, and we need them.
I agree with that. I think one of the lessons here is something the Senator said earlier, and I want to emphasize it. If you lose sight of good policy in the effort to get the right numbers, this is a bad exercise. A tax reform is good policy. It'll cause growth. It'll also generate revenues.
Congressman, I think you should be more bolder on taxes, value-added tax, shift from taxing income to taxing spending. Actually, there's a lot of agreement across the political spectrum that that's the right general idea, but there's very little agreement that you want to go anywhere near VAT. And just if I could add to what Dr. Holtz-Eakin said about the debt and how much time do we have, which is a great question. We have no idea. It depends not just on us, it depends on the world. We are the world's #1 reserve currency. If the world shifts in its portfolio preferences away from the dollar towards, I don't know, the euro, the renminbi, some other currency, other countries would like that role, then the time frame is much shorter. If we stay #1 in this specific reserve currency sense indefinitely because the Chinese broke their financial system or the Europeans failed to turn around their sovereign debt, then we have a lot more time. Nobody knows the answer to that question. We should start now. We should not act precipitately or in a way that damages ourselves. We should set ourselves on a course where people say, yes, the Americans have got their fiscal affairs in order looking out 2-3 decades. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Representative Delaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for organizing such a terrific panel. I thought the comments really have been exceptional, and I think, Senator Gregg, you started us off in almost a pitch-perfect tone, so I appreciate that very much. I have, and Dr. Holtz-Eakin, I think that you framed the urgency of dealing with this appropriately, and it seems to me we almost have some room to overcorrect for the problem, because if we act now, as we know, we don't have to affect current beneficiaries or even people who are close to being current beneficiaries. And if we almost can overcorrect for the problem, if we have more economic growth than we expect, if we can actually bend the cost curve in health care, or there's other demographic shifts, it gives us tremendous flexibility. And it kind of tees up a question or two questions I'd like to ask for each member of the panel. The first is, it seems to me our debt issue should be broken into almost two categories. The debt that we have in years, call it 1 to 10, which we tend to talk a lot about because our budget framing is in 10 years. And then the debt crisis that occurs in years 11 through 20, or post-11, if you will. And it seems to me, at least in my own opinion, it's the second component that is of most concern and will lead to all the negative consequences everyone's talked about. It'll ultimately crowd out every other priority in our budget. There will be an interest rate crisis, as Dr. Johnson referenced. We don't know when it'll happen. The only thing we know for sure is we will not be able to predict when it happens. So my question is, if we were able to successfully deal with the future debt concerns that are depicted on the graph so well, do we have more flexibility to deal with years 1 through 10? In other words, is really the problem here the debt in the out years as opposed to debt in the short years? Because it seems to me we do need to be making investments in our economy, not so much for the purposes of pure economic stimulus, but for the purposes of preparing a broader number of Americans for a new world that has fundamentally changed because of globalization and technology. And a broad number of Americans have been left behind because of that, and a narrow number of Americans have benefited because of that. Not because they did anything wrong, it's just the way the cards have been dealt. So it feels to me like we do need to make investments, and if we could deal with the long tail risk on our debt, our ability to manage, it seems to me, the debt in the next 10 years is dramatically enhanced, and we're in a much better position to do the things we need to do. So my first question is, does the panel agree with that? And then the second question, and I'll lay them both out, and this way you could deal with them at the same time, is Dr. Johnson, you said something very interesting about thinking about revenue and spending levels in the future. And I agree with what Dr. Holtz-Eakin said, which is this is a mathematical formula. We should figure out what we spend, and then we should develop revenue gathering methodologies to match what we spend. But should we, and historically we've thought about these things in kind of the 18 to 19 to perhaps the 20% range. And that's been based on a looking back approach. And whenever we've gotten outside of those bounds, either on the revenue side or on the spending side, we end up in very significant issues like we have now. And we did both of those things. We went way outside it on the revenue, we went way outside it on the expenditures, and now we have a significant debt. It's pretty obvious. In the future, and the world has changed, we're in a global economy, technology's changed everything, we're likely to have a sustained period of income inequality because people with educations and access to capital do really well in this world. And then you have the demographic changes. Should we think about that number differently? Is it 18 to 19, or in the future is it 21 to 22? So is the debt in the next 10 years the problem is the first question, and what should that range be when we're thinking about years 11 through 20 in the future? We'll start with Senator Gregg.
Well, I don't think you can ignore the next few years, but there's no question that if you're going to address this issue in a way that has substantive impact on the future of our nation, the prosperity of our children, and our standard of living, it's the second 10 years and the third 10 years that are the important years, in my opinion, relative to policy changes you can make today that impact those years. That's actually why I was so encouraged by the President putting change CPI on the table, because in the first 10 years, it's not a big number relative to Washington terms. It's 200 to 300 billion. But in the second 10 years, it's probably close to $1 trillion. The third 10 years, it's multiple trillions. It's a compounding event. It's also why I suggested that any agreement that be reached has to be subject in the Senate to a 67-vote point of order, because otherwise nobody's going to believe the changes which really start to grab in the second and third 10 years. I do believe the size of the government is going to have to grow simply because of the demographic shift. That's why, as probably one of the more fiscally conservative members of the Senate, if not the most at the time, although Coburn was on the commission too, I voted for going to 21% as the size of the government under Simpson-Bowles because of this huge shift in demographics.
Dr. Rivlin?
The second 10 years or the third 10 years are obviously the most important, and most of the sensible reforms and entitlements don't cut in until then, and that's why we need them. But I wouldn't ignore the first 10 years either. I think we can raise more revenue by reforming the tax code, and that would help our growth sooner than the than the end of 10 years. And I don't think we know how long it might be before we had some kind of a debt crisis. And the cost of servicing the debt will rise quite quickly, even if interest rates only go back to normal. On the size of government, I think we're going to have to go up, and I would think actually a little higher, 22 and a half is likely to be necessary to absorb this number of seniors.
Great questions. I feel like it's an oral exam. Let me be brief. I mean, again, I would share the urgency about not waiting for the second 10 years. I understand we'll get bigger changes from those, and there are a couple reasons for that. One is you don't want to rely on the projections, the precision of these projections, enormous amounts of uncertainty. You can't count on getting to the second 10 years in ways that the charts might appear, and that's a risk I don't want to run. Second is you have to somehow commit to fixing the second 10 years and do nothing in the first. Hard to sell that we're going to be serious in 10 years. So moving now I think is very important. And I don't think that investing is at odds with fixing. As I said before, these are both imperatives. And lastly, I think there's a big difference between the size of government and the composition of what it does. And I think there's a very real competitiveness issue and education reforms that we need. They're not at odds with picking a size of government that's within the traditional norms.
I agree completely with the way you frame the question. I think we need to think about human capital, investing in human capital in a global world where we have a lot of people breathing down our necks one way or another, and a lot of people who want to trade with us on a reasonable basis. The shift in inequality since the tax reform in 1986 is stunning, and I think was quite unexpected by anyone who was involved in designing the tax system at that point. And I think we need to consider that and think about the opportunities for younger Americans, education and healthcare that's available to people who don't have a lot of resources right now, but who are the foundation of productivity and competitiveness as you look out through the rest of this century. I think we're having a very good discussion about the size of government. I think that's exactly, as Senator Gregg said, that's where you should start. What does it take to provide a reasonable level of public goods, both the pro-productivity kind and the redistribution kind? My math comes out with a different number, and we should look at those details. We may be talking about different end dates, but I see something more like 23, 24% for the medium term. I'm looking at decades here, but I think that's the right conversation to have. What does it take, given your demographics, and given the public goods you want to provide, and then how are you going to finance that? And I'm absolutely on board with the idea that you don't say, yes, well, we're going to fix this in 15 years. Or I think Senator Gregg hits the nail on the head when he says, put some in legislation that's easy to repeal when things get tough. Absolutely don't do that. Act now, but don't act for immediate austerity. You don't need that. You don't want that. Act in a way that's consistent with investing for the future while demonstrating you've made credible commitments to fiscal responsibility. And I'm here, I think, representing the view that you need to move much more on the revenue side than even my distinguished colleagues want to move.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Campbell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, 3 doctors and a senator. Could be a movie, if you guys want to consider that. There's the old yarn that the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem. I first came to Congress in 2005, and I would argue then that there was a minority in both parties that thought that the debt and deficit were a significant, or certainly the significant problem. I thought we'd kind of gotten over that. I thought that by now maybe people see that this is a serious problem, if not the most serious problem. Yesterday, the President came and spoke to us, the House Republican Conference, and I was frankly discouraged. Not that he came and spoke, that's always good, but I was discouraged by some of what he said, which was that he made it clear that he didn't believe that balancing the budget was something that we ever needed to do. Now, I'm a CPA, so balancing the budget has a symmetry to it, which I sort of like as an accountant. But from my view, balancing the budget is much more than that, that it's something that creates the kind of conditions, or frankly, to be on the trajectory that will balance the budget, will create the kind of conditions to unleash the growth that we have before us that Senator Gregg has discussed. I believe that what the President said, as I recall yesterday, was that he wanted to stabilize the deficit at 3 to 4% of GDP. That, to me, doesn't solve the problem. And I was discouraged by the idea that that was what his main objective was, and that any other objective beyond that he felt was unnecessary. Your thoughts?
Let me start. I think the important thing now, and we've all stressed it, is not to have your debt growing faster than your GDP, and get it on a downward trajectory. It's not necessary, in my opinion, to balance the budget exactly, but we should have deficits that are well below our growth of GDP on the average. That's what we did at the end of World War II. We had a huge debt then, over 100% of GDP. We didn't run surpluses. We ran small deficits and grew the economy faster than the debt. We got to a more comfortable state where we were down around debt about 30% of GDP. I'd like to get there eventually, but not so fast that we wreck the economy.
What Dr. Riveron said is exactly in line with what the International Monetary Fund says to countries around the world, and what your government, through the Treasury Department, urges the IMF to say to countries: stabilize, bring down debt to GDP. So you want to have growth, and considering how relative, you need to consider how much growth you can achieve when you're thinking about reasonable, responsible deficit targets. But stabilizing, thinking about what is the right debt to GDP for the country, that's the right conversation.
So I think the problem with stabilizing debt is we already have too much. So you're stabilizing at a high and dangerous level with unknown risks and like higher interest rates, which would further tie the hands of future democracies. I mean, that doesn't make sense for the United States. I will speak out on behalf of balancing the budget. I mean, I'm a PhD economist, and I was indoctrinated that balancing the budget is stupid and primeval and represents a Neanderthal way to think. I've come around to the point of view that we need fiscal discipline in the United States, and a commitment to something like a balanced budget is something that will be important, that you can design balanced budget goals with a sufficient flexibility for economic and national security emergencies, that they're not dangerous to growth, and that we ought to think very hard about a commitment to balanced budgets in one form or another.
If our goal is to reach a deal, we shouldn't get engaged in this fight. I'm 100% for balancing the budget. I did it as governor, and it was my goal here in the Congress for years. But our goal should be to stabilize the policies which are driving our debt. And that means we've got to get everybody in the room around those policies and address them. And in accomplishing that, the outcome will be, the result will be that we will move close enough to a balanced budget so that those of us who want to balance the budget will have a reasonable shot at it, and those who want to maintain a deficit of 2 to 3% will have their ability to make that argument too. But the goal, we shouldn't get sidetracked. In my opinion, we shouldn't get sidetracked on this debate, because it really isn't going to move the process forward. Our process needs to be to reach a comprehensive bipartisan agreement. It has to be bipartisan because this is a divided government. And so this debate, I think, is sidetracks us. Even though it's very important as a Republican that we balance the budget, I know that that's not the position of the president, and I don't want to hold him to my position in order to get a deal.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Senator Murphy to the committee, and as a former House member, just add, I hope you remember some of the little people you met along the way. We're glad you're here at the Joint Economic Committee.
That's why I asked for this committee, to remind me of all my friends in the House. This is a fantastic panel, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for putting it together. I've learned a lot already, and I have two questions, and maybe I'll only have time to fit one of them in. But one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the relative unanimity of this concept that you decide what you need to spend money on, what you absolutely need, get a government no bigger than what is necessary, and then you fashion revenues around it in a way that makes sense so that you've got a revenue structure that promotes growth. And so I think it may be worthwhile, at least for me, to spend just a little bit of time talking about, from an economic perspective, what we actually need to spend money on. It worries me that we're spending 3% of our GDP on infrastructure when Europe is spending twice that, China's spending 4 times that. It worries me that it's 3 times as expensive today to get a advanced degree in this country in real dollars than it was in 1980, that we're spending less money today on worker training than we ever have before. And so I guess my question is, what does the data tell us are the greatest chances to get real economic multipliers out of investment and spending? What are the accounts that you would recommend that we be protecting or advocating for increases to try to generate real economic growth? We don't, for instance, in this last round of negotiations over the CR, we seem to protect defense spending and very little else when, well, you certainly have an argument aside from economic multipliers as to why you should spend on defense. It doesn't necessarily add as does education investment or job training investment or infrastructure investment. So can you guys just talk a little bit about what portions of the discretionary budget you think are most important to be held harmless in order to kind of generate economic growth down the line in this new framework?
Well, that's an eye of the beholder issue, but the first obligation of a national government is national defense, in my opinion. That doesn't mean you hold it harmless, because I happen to believe the Defense Department can be subject to fairly stringent review, and that probably save a heck of a lot of money. And I actually think that that is one of the pluses of the Budget Act agreement of 2011 and the sequester, is it's going to force the Defense Department to face up to some of this. I'm a great believer in investing in infrastructure. I believe that that does give you a very significant return, and it's hard dollars on hard projects. I think the biggest failure of the stimulus package, besides the fact it wasn't paid for and it was too much, which were two fairly big failures, was that it only like 16% of it went into infrastructure, which was foolish. I think R&D is important. I think education is important. But I think Dr. Ivlin's made the point. Discretionary is not where the problem is. These are all discretionary issues. The problem is not in the discretionary accounts. The problem is in the entitlement accounts when it comes to spending. And so the focus should be entirely on entitlement accounts and how you make those deliver quality outcomes at a better price.
I would favor spending on smart infrastructure investment and smart education and science investment as shifting toward those priorities. But I think it is really a question of how well you spend the money rather than the quantity, and we haven't done a terribly good job in spending our infrastructure in the best way. So it isn't just a question of more. But the real point is the one Senator Gregg made, that unless we curb the rates of growth of spending on older people primarily, that those spending are going to squeeze out, and are already doing it, investments in young people and eventual higher growth.
I can only echo the comments. It's very important to spend this money well. And I spent 2 years on a bipartisan transportation policy project looking at reforms. We have 100 transportation programs that do not unify to serve any federal purpose and do not deliver anything in the way of economic benefits to a nation that needs better infrastructure. And so getting these programs to actually produce value for their dollars is step number one. That goes in other areas as well. I mean, I think education and health, we both know, are delivering products of highly uncertain quality for enormous amounts of money that go up a lot. And we need to clean that out. And that I think, is one of the hidden pieces of the defense spending. I mean, that's not all planes and tanks. There's big pension problems and big health problems in the defense budget as well. We need to fix those, and that'll help us focus on the core things, which are national security and basic research and infrastructure, things our founders would recognize as government.
I would agree with much of what's been said, but want to add and reinforce the importance of children and children's health and children's education. I'm very worried about the cuts to Medicaid. About half of Medicaid goes to children. These are the future of the country. That the way the economy has played out over the past 3 decades, completely unanticipated, has skewed the income distribution massively in an almost unprecedented way in this country. And it means that many people at the bottom end of the income distribution can't invest, don't have the money to invest in the kind of education they want for their children, and they can't afford decent food in some cases, or there's a trade-off between food and health care. This is a terrible situation. And in terms of holding people harmless, Senator, I would try to hold harmless, really try very hard to hold harmless the children who are right now in the line of fire for a lot of the austerity that's been discussed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great, thanks, Senator. Final question, Representative Amash.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here and sharing your insights. I want to discuss a constitutional balanced budget amendment for a little bit. About a year and a half ago, there were votes in the House and the Senate on balanced budget amendments, or BBAs. There were 2 versions in the Senate. The Senate had 67 senators vote yes on at least one version. In the House, we came up about 23 votes short of the 2/3 necessary. States have balanced budget amendments in their constitution, and they follow different fiscal rules. So I want to ask Dr. Johnson, You've had concerns about capping spending as a percentage of GDP. Could you elaborate on those concerns?
Actually, I was expressing support for what Senator Gregg said, which is you should first decide what's the right level of spending as you look out over some decades, given the nature of your society, how you think the world is going to change, what threats you'll face, military and non-military threats, and what role you want government to play. And obviously, there's a very wide range of views about the role of government in this room. That's the right place to start the discussion. If you can agree on that, and we've heard 19%, 21%, 22%, and I think I'm at 23, 24%. That's about the right spectrum for views. Once you've decided on that, then figure out how to fund that in a responsible way. And aiming for balancing the budget, I think is fine. I also agree with Senator Gregg. It gets in the way now, and the right way to operationalize the goal is think about debt relative to GDP.
Would you object to putting into a balanced budget amendment a cap?
So I have never, will never describe balancing the idea of balancing the budget as a Neanderthal or it's actually that is not my view. The United States was run for the first 150 years on the principle that we should aim to balance the budget at least in good times. However, there come times which are not so good, and there were times like this in the 19th century also, where it is advisable to have the ability to slip out of balance towards a deficit, assuming that you share the goal of coming back towards more closely towards balanced budget and bringing down the debt to GDP. My goal for debt to GDP is far below where it is today and far below where it is in those charts. I want 40 to 50% based on experience. But that's the heuristic I would propose for the modern world, not the heuristic that served them well in the 1830s.
Dr. Rivlin, would you oppose the idea of putting a cap, percentage of spending as a percentage of GDP in a balanced budget amendment?
I think it's a diversion from the real problem, which is thinking about how do we control the cost of the entitlements so they're not rising faster than the economy is growing. That's hard, and we've got to do it. And how do we set up a tax system that is more pro-growth? Putting algebra in the Constitution, as my former colleague Charlie Schultz used to say, I think doesn't solve anything. And if you are to put a balanced budget amendment in, you have to put in so many exceptions that it's gobbledygook. I would not do it through the Constitution. I would do it through action of the Congress and the President.
How about the idea of just balancing the budget every year with exception of emergencies? Would you support that idea, or would you?
No, I wouldn't support it as a general idea because there are emergencies, and we have just lived through an emergency.
But with the exception of I think any balanced budget proposal is going to have an escape clause for emergencies. So
well, it depends what an emergency is. If the economy is in deep recession, balancing the budget is a crazy and counterproductive thing to do.
Would you be more likely to support a policy, say a constitutional amendment that was counter-cyclical?
Then you get into the writing algebra into the Constitution. I'm opposed to doing this through the Constitution. Do it through policy.
Senator Gregg, in June 2011, you wrote that conservatives must not let advocacy for a balanced budget amendment be an excuse for avoiding votes on difficult but crucial reforms, and you've echoed that here. And I agree with that. Do you have any intrinsic objections, though, to a well-crafted, bipartisan and broad balanced budget amendment?
No, I supported it numerous times. My point there was that there were a balanced budget amendment is going to take years to ratify, years. And it gives some people political cover to say, well, I'm for the balanced budget amendment, therefore I don't have to make this tough vote because I've already voted for the balanced budget amendment. There are very tough votes that are going to have to be made here that have nothing to do with whether or not you're for or against a balanced budget amendment, and people shouldn't use the balanced budget debate as a way to get off the point of making those tough votes. That was my point.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask one more question?
We are out of time, Representative. I apologize about that. If you'd like to submit it in writing to the witnesses, would you mind responding promptly to Representative?
Thank you, panel.
Thank you so much. This is such a great discussion. Frankly, I hate to end that way, since this has been one of the most thoughtful and insightful panels we've had an opportunity to hear from. This is the right issue at the right time. One theme we hear is the easy votes are over. If we're going to tackle our biggest challenges, easy votes are decades behind us. And so on behalf of Vice Chairman Klobuchar and I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks to the members for their questions. The hearing is adjourned.